So we have here the text of the message, and as I mentioned, one of the most famous stories of the Bible. This is the story of David and Goliath. Now, we are not going to go the whole way through the story. We're going to probably break this up into about 3 messages or so, just for I want to try to include as much as I can out of the story. I remember the first time I taught this. It was in 1979. I was a senior in high school, and I was teaching junior church. And I had my future brother-in-law, I didn't know it at the time. He was a very tall fella. And we recruited him to be Goliath. And we got him all the equipment we could put together. And I had an old German helmet that my grandmother had given me. And we used that on him. And so we did all this thing before the kids. And the kids had a good time. And I told them I had a little rock. And I said, you take this rock. And whenever I do the sling thing, and let it go, then you take the rock and bang it against the helmet, and then he'd fall over. And it worked out pretty good. It wasn't exactly biblical, as we'll see when we get to the story, but it was we had a lot of fun doing it. I won't do all that tonight. I'm trying to look and see, Doug, you'd probably be Goliath. I think you're the tallest fella here, but we won't go through all that. But what I'd like to do is break it down into several sections. And tonight, this will be the preparation for the battle that we'll look into. Whenever you speak of Goliath, you think of something that's large. And Goliath was a very large man, which we'll get to. But when we start the story, we see a breaking down, a spiritual breakdown, which has been going on since as we looked at before with King Saul and his disobedience to God. Disobedience always follows with its spiritual deterioration, and that's what we have both with Saul and with the nation. There's uncertainty. There are political upheavals. Everything follows this. You can go through American history, and you see it there. If you go back to the 1730s or so, it might have been the 40s, but you see George Whitefield going up and down the colonies, through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and down to Georgia, and everything in between. In South Carolina, I was in Maryland. I was where I was assistant pastor, and right down the road from us was an old Presbyterian church that had been there for hundreds of years, and there was a little plaque there that said that George Whitefield had preached there. And I went down to Charleston, where my daughter has a house, and we were staying there for a while, and walking around, and there's a church in Charleston, I think, that he had preached. And so he had gone all the way through the country, and what he had done, preaching the Word of God, preaching the new birth, and he actually made a cohesive people out of very diverse different people. They all became, not everybody obviously, but a large segment of the population became believers. And that kind of set the tone for the nation, which in just a few years was going to be an independent nation, which was founded on Christian principles. And that lasted for a very long time within our country. And of course, those things don't last forever, and we're at the very tail end of that now. But what happens is you start out with a strong spiritual foundation, and people begin to disobey, and people begin to neglect spiritual things, and then things begin to deteriorate. And that's what we have here. We mentioned the last time we were talking that Saul had disobeyed, and he had lost the kingdom, and God had sent Samuel to anoint another man who would take his place. But the Spirit of God had left Saul, and an evil spirit had come upon him. And this evil spirit was permitted to torment him, and he had to call for somebody to play music for him to calm his nerves. And it just so happened that person was David. So David was working for Saul, and he would go in between his father's house, help with the sheep, come back to the palace at different times. But whenever you have a leader, and especially a king such as this, who is unstable, perhaps mentally unstable, maybe has dementia. I don't think that Saul did, but we can probably associate ourselves with those. Whenever you have a president, who doesn't know where he's going, and that's very disconcerting for the people. And that's what we had here. But it's not just the people that are saying, well, our leadership, well, what do we do? It's the enemies outside which begin to see things as well. And the Philistines saw this. They understood that word gets back. I mean, the enemies always have ears, everywhere. the word gets back to them, hey, now's a good time for us to come in and attack. And that's what concerns me about our nation right now. We're in a very low position now. We have to, as people, we need to be prepared for that. What's going to happen? We don't know. Maybe the Lord will be merciful. Maybe the Lord will raise up some real leadership in our country. Maybe not. But whatever happens, we have to be prepared for it. But we can see these cycles. This isn't, we look at it and we see our nation crumbling and we say, this is terrible. This is never, no, this happens all through history. You just read the scriptures and you can see the same patterns going through Israel that we have seen in our own nation and around the world. So you have it here. There's always a connection between a nation's political strength and its spiritual vitality. When the spiritual vitality of a nation wanes, so does its political strength. And the Philistines saw that, and they came out for battle, and they would take advantage of that. Now, we are in a much different nation than we are today. Whenever the good and solid influence of the Lord is removed, as we see with Saul, evil will replace it. And when it does replace it, it brings destruction. And along with destruction comes tyranny and oppression. We can be guaranteed of seeing that. And we live in a much different nation today than when Washington proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving. Or even Roosevelt, 80 years ago, proclaimed a day of prayer. And we had all of the horrible events of World War II, and even back then, though they wouldn't be considered biblical Christians, they understood we better call for prayer here because we're in a dire situation. But we live in a very different nation today. Today, I believe I can say with authority that the enemies of our country have been working to destroy the nation both spiritually and morally. And they are encouraged, and it's not just the people. We have to remember, it's not just the people that you see, these slimy politicians that we would say, that they lie every time they open their mouth, they're lying. It's not just them. They are being empowered by spiritual beings, I think, in high places, as we're told. And they are working overtime to destroy any influence of good that comes from the Word and from God's people. So we have to keep that in mind. So then, the Philistines begin gathering together. Saul responds with an army. He gets his army together. Now, I'm sure this army looked impressive. They would come out in battle array, and they went out on one side of a mountain, and the Philistines were on another side. And what you had here was quite interesting. Both sides had high ground. When you have a valley in between, and what it did was cause a stalemate. So you had anybody that would make the first move to come down as an army would put themselves in a position of a weaker position than the other. So that's what caused the stalemate. You say 40 days this went on. There was a couple reasons, I think. I think the Philistines were a little apprehensive about taking on Saul, because if you look at what had already happened, if you read through, which we didn't cover, but Saul had led to many victories against the Philistines. Jonathan, his son, had led a great victory against an entire battalion of Philistines, and fighting uphill. That as him and his armor bearer were going uphill, and you have this garrison of the Philistines. I'm not exactly sure how many were involved, but it was a large number of soldiers. Jonathan took them on single-handedly and defeated them. So there's some apprehension on the side of the Philistines, as well as with the Israelites, because the Israelites were being led by an unstable leader, an unstable king. And this king was going through the motions without the power of God. The Spirit of the Lord had left him. It had departed. And so he, like Samson, went out as he did before. Remember the story of Samson. Samson, who was a Nazirite, was not permitted to cut his hair, and that actually was a symbol of his strength. And whenever he gave out his secret to Delilah, and the men came in and cut off his hair, and he went out just like he did before, thinking that he was going to defeat the Philistines, and they grabbed him, threw him on the ground, and bound him. And I think we have a similar situation here with Saul. Saul was going out to battle as he did before, but he's very apprehensive, because I think he senses the Spirit of the Lord is not with me. And so We then, at this battle, we're introduced to this man by the name of Goliath in verses 4 through 7. And he is called a champion of the Philistines. And the word champion is an interesting word in the Hebrew. It is a man of the middles. Now, this is a man who is powerful enough and has the stature to go into no man's land and to issue challenges to the enemy. And this was something that happened frequently in the ancient world. It's found in different areas of historical records where this had happened. And he would go down. Here you have this man, this huge man, challenging the enemy to provide a man to fight. So and this happened in the Middle Ages as well, and even in, I wouldn't say recent times, but within the past several hundred years. This man would have been the strongest man that the Philistines had, and he was a giant. So again, we can say that anything large today may be described as Goliath. Perhaps you've heard of the Goliath beetle. I think I wrote down here, the larva of the Goliath beetle weighs a quarter pound, when it's mature, and it's 9 inches long. It looks like a maggot. So you can picture this huge worm, 9 inches. That's longer than the span of my hand, that this thing is. And whenever it pupates into an adult, I think it's about a 4-inch long bug, this huge, monstrous bug. So that's called the Goliath beetle. And the reason that it's called that is because of the Goliath, the giant here. He's called a giant. And there's some disagreement about his actual height. You go to some of the Septuagint in the Greek, it only puts him at like 6'5" or so, which you have to remember that the Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew, so there's going to be some discrepancies as you read it. And there's some issues about, well, how long was a cubit? The guy was 6 cubits in a span. How long was a span? So they have some issues there. But I think that overall we could say safely that he was somewhere between 8.5 to 9.5 feet tall. And the reason I say that, I don't believe the shorter estimates, because Saul himself was known as a large man. He was head and shoulders taller than anyone in Israel. Now, if you take the average man in Israel, maybe 5'6" or so, and you get up there, Saul himself would have been over 6 foot tall, but he's not called a giant. Goliath is called a giant. And one of the reasons is that Gath, as we're told in Joshua 11:22, and I think also somewhere in Deuteronomy, I didn't mark that one down, it was a place where the Anakims had fled after they had been defeated. Some of them survived, and they were in Gath and some of the other towns in the country of the Philistines. So we know that there were some survivors of the giants, and it's believed that Goliath was one of them. His armor was extremely heavy. Now, this coat of mail was not the kind of mail you think of like with the English knights, where they have little rings. Rather, it was a scaled armor where you would take a plate of brass and cover it over another plate of brass. And the armor weighed about 120 pounds. That's a significant amount of armor just to have on to cover your chest and perhaps your back. I'm not sure if they covered the back or not. But it was extremely heavy. His javelin, the spear, the javelin was brass, which he carried in the back, and he had a spear, which was described as a weaver's beam, probably like a joist in a house is what it sounds like, at least my old house, one of these huge, monstrous beams. And the head of the spear weighed about 25 pounds. It might have been less, it might have been somewhere around there. And this man would have been a walking fortress, a walking tank, if you can try to picture that. And he may not have been very fast with all that armor, but we don't know. You look at a crocodile, or like a grizzly bear or hippo, for example. And those things are fast. So this man who was very powerful may also have been very fast, but I can't say for sure. But regardless, he would not have been taken down very easily. I don't think any single man would have wanted to try to take him on. And spiritually speaking, we could say that Goliath represents Satan. a very powerful foe determined to undermine the people of God. So we have here, I think, a good illustration of how God deals with Satan and his desire to destroy the people of God. The challenge was to send a man to fight. We see that in verses 8 through 10. And that was to determine the battle in single combat. Now, we'll find out that though he did speak a good game, when he did die, what did the Philistines do? Did they say, okay, we'll submit to you? What did they do? They ran away. So they weren't going to keep their word anyway. You have him issuing out these challenges. And as I said, there are several recorded instances of this in history where knights would meet on the battlefield and duke it out, things like that. So what we have here in verse 10, I think, is important because this is going to bring in David later. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man to fight that we may fight together. The armies of Israel were the hosts of the Lord, his armies. Remember, this is a theocracy. Saul is king, yes, but the true king of Israel is the Lord himself, is Jehovah. So the challenge was going out to the armies of God. And this is going to be noted later by David. Now, so what's going to happen here? You have this man coming down. He issues the challenge to God's people. What's the response? Well, looking at verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, remember the history of Israel. How many times had God intervened in their battles? Now remember, from the very beginning, you have the people of Israel with their backs to the Red Sea and the army of Pharaoh coming at them. We're going to die. What does God do? God opens the sea and they pass through the sea. And then where their enemies pursue them into the sea, what does God do? Closes the sea, crushes the armies of Pharaoh. The strongest armies of the world at that time, the strongest army of the world at that time, the Egyptians, crushed under the weight of the waters of the Red Sea. They go into the Promised Land. Here you have Jericho. The thickness of the walls, I think you could have a chariot race on these walls. It was so thick. What does God do? Here you have people marching around 7 times at the end, and they blow trumpets, and what does he do? The walls come down, and the people of Israel go in and defeat the people of Jericho. See, this is the history. And then you could go on and on and on how God has intervened. But they forget. They forget their own history. And as Saul no longer has the presence of God in his life, he is now living in fear. So what did they do? Well, it says that they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The word dismayed there, see if I can find my notes here, is broken. They were so frightened they could not hold up. They were terrorized. They couldn't stand before this challenge. Now, for some reason, though, the Philistines didn't take advantage of this fear. There was, as I said, some apprehension, which we know in the providence of God, God was holding off the Philistines for the right man to come in. But Saul should have been the one to do this fighting. Remember, he was a head and shoulders taller than anybody else. He was the anointed of the Lord. He had proven himself in battle. He had conquered those threatening Israel before. He defeated the Ammonites and established his kingdom. But he did not have the presence of God. And they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And that's where they needed to remember, as we ought to as well, Joshua's admonition to Israel. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do all the law which Moses my servant commanded. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. Saul had disobeyed this. He decided to do his own thing against God, and the result is that they are fleeing before their enemies. The Lord had promised them, if they remain faithful to him, that one would chase 1,000. But instead now we have one on the other side making an entire army tremble. If the Lord had been with Saul, if he had not been a disobedient king and rebellious king, I believe it would have been Saul who defeated the giant. but he's under judgment. And there was no promise of victory should he engage the giant. He's under God's curse. There's already a man in the waiting to take his place. He had forfeited his kingdom, so that is a situation they're in. And that leads us then to the last part of this. This is the introduction of David once again in verse 12. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. So David is again reintroduced to our story here. Now remember, at this point, David has not yet proven himself. Now, he had killed the lion and the bear, but he had not proven himself in battle against the enemies of God. So though he was anointed by God, in status and reputation, he was still known as the youngest son of Jesse. If you look at verse 13, the 3 oldest sons of Jesse, or verse 14, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. So you have here David, who is not proven yet. He is known as the youngest, and he's a musician. He's known as the court musician. If Saul's in a state of spiritual depression, he would call in David. David would play on the harp, and his spirits would be lifted. After David was finished, David would go back for a while to his father's house and keep sheep. So here you have this man David, and he's introduced again to the story. The emphasis here is that God is preparing to do a great thing and bring a great victory, but he's going to do it in such a way that it will be evident that he is the source of their victory and that the glory is going to go to the Lord. And this is how God works all the time. God uses seemingly insignificant men. You think, for example, of Moses. Moses was an important man, but where was Moses at that particular time when God called him? Well, Moses had fled as a fugitive from Egypt. He was 40 years in the wilderness keeping sheep. And he was quite content to stay there. He had been prince. He'd lived in Egypt as a high-ranking official, but now he is keeping sheep. And what happens? Well, he comes across the burning bush and he's called by God. You're going to go set the people free. Oh, what? I can't even talk, Lord. Here you have a man that would have been trained in all of the specialties of the court. Warfare, tactics, public speaking. He would have been taught all these things, how to behave as a prince. But he had spent 40 years in the wilderness and he didn't want to be bothered. The Lord said, you're the one that's going. The Lord had put him through all of these things to prepare him for this. You think of who did the Lord call to be his apostles? The Lord didn't go knocking on Herod's palace door. Hey, do you have anybody that would be eligible and available for apostleship? I'm trying to find some good qualified men. Could you send me their resumes? I need some, or maybe go to the armies or among the priesthood. Who did he call? He called fishermen. He called a tax collector. He did call one fellow, Simon the Zealot. He would have probably been always looking over his shoulder with the Romans. I don't know, who knows what he was involved in before. That's a principle that we see. 1 Corinthians 1:26, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. David was one of these men, and I believe that it is being pointed out to remind us of this principle. God is going to receive the glory for this. This is not anything that any man would be able to do on his own. David was not so entirely skilled that he'd be able to take on this man without armor, as we'll see, with a stone, with a rock. With all, and this man having all of the best military equipment, unless God was with him. And so that's, I believe, what the principle we have here. And then we have God's providence again working. God's timing is always perfect. So if you look behind the scenes again, and you can see the hand of God. So what happened here? We have David being introduced. Well, how does David end up on the battlefield? Well, Jesse was concerned. How are my boys doing? He had 3 boys that were serving under Saul. He was concerned about them. he said to his youngest son David, who happened to be available, he wasn't needed at the palace because the king wasn't there anymore. The king was now on the battlefield. David, although he was Saul's armor bearer, apparently he was dismissed and somebody else took his place for some reason. He's sent home to take care of sheep. Or maybe David was sent at home to take care of sheep, and this battle came up and they couldn't get David back in time to be the king's armor bearer. Whatever the situation was, David was with his father. And his father said, I'm going to give you some stuff. Take this stuff to your brothers and to their captains and see how they're doing. And so everything's gathered up. David goes to the battlefield. The Lord works out the timing perfectly, as he always does in his providence. And this little errand that God sends David on is going to alter the course of the battle. No one would have ever thought that. Jesse didn't say, I need to get David to the battlefield. I know that my older boys, they probably can't handle it, but my youngest son David, he'll get there and he'll make a difference. No, David was sent on an errand. And his older brother is going to point this out. What are you doing here? You come to look at the battle. We'll see that. So when he gets there, there's many skirmishes, I believe, are going on. Neither side was prepared to make a full-fledged, decisive battle that went on, as we're told, for 40 days. God held them back until just the right time to fulfill his own purposes. And what he was going to do was going to show once again that the battle was the Lord's, but also to get this young man, this inexperienced man, probably in his late teens, maybe your early 20s, we're not exactly sure at this point how old he was, but he's going to be put on the battlefield and he's going to do something no one would ever think could possibly happen. But all of these events are put together so that they fall together so that David is there at just the right time and he hears what he needs to hear, as we'll see in the next couple of sermons. So then, as we continue watching the struggles within our own nation, our own country, we live in very unstable times, uncertain times, folks. And we need to be going to the Lord. Lord, please protect your people. Please provide leadership. Please help us through this. The election this year could be life-changing for all of us. We don't know. I'm glad Tammy's going to take care of, I want to point this out, she's not going on another pleasure trip. She's taking care of some grandchildren down in South Carolina. I wanted her back before election, because who knows what's going to happen once those ballots are cast. And we don't know. We live in uncertain times. We need to be in prayer that the Lord would be merciful to his people. But we need to also remember he never loses control, even in the most dire of circumstances. Judgment may come. The children of Israel went through judgment multiple times. But as servants of the King of Kings, we need not fear. He will use both us and the circumstances, whatever we face, to bring glory to himself. Let us pray.